So you've done a lot of work on elliptic curve cryptography. I would say
a long time ago, it must be said. when you're working on the research end of stuff, you work on stuff that's just about pre-market. And if you kind of look, we're recording this under HTTPS, yeah? We've already used elliptic curve cryptography to set up this session. I've got a mobile phone here. This is doing elliptic curve cryptography connections every few seconds or so in various apps. Every time I go anywhere on the internet, I'm using elliptic curve cryptography. It's not just before market anymore. Something that, as a researcher, I did years ago, but it's now out there.
So I take opportunities on the podcast to educate on things that maybe the listeners aren't familiar with.
Okay.
Can you since you're the renowned expert on elliptic curve cryptography, even though it's old, for many listeners, it's new. What is elliptic curve cryptography and why is it important versus non-elliptic?
Okay, so traditionally in cryptography, if any of your listeners have done any form of public key cryptography, they would have heard of the RSA crypto system from the mid-70s, okay? And this gets its security by taking two very large numbers and multiplying them together. For humans, if I take 2 and 3 and I multiply them together, I get 6. That's easy. If I give you 6, then you have to think for slightly longer to work out that you can that 2 and 3 divide into it. And as the number gets bigger, it's easier to multiply, but it's harder to split apart. And that also happens to computers. So it's very easy to multiply, but it's very hard to split apart. The trouble is it's not that hard. It's not hard enough to split apart. So RSA keys have to be huge. So they have to be many thousands of bits long. And really, to get the kind of security that we would like for modern applications, the RSA key size has to be astronomically huge. And actually, no one deploys RSA keys of that astronomically huge size because we don't care. It's because everyone's now transitioned to elliptic curve cryptography. So in the last 10 years, you've seen everything translate to elliptic curve cryptography. Signal uses elliptic curve cryptography. HTTPS is using elliptic curve cryptography. So why do they use elliptic curve cryptography? So we have that math problem of multiplying two numbers together. It's easy. Splitting it apart is hard. So it turns out that elliptic curves are kind of this mathematical structure which has a hard problem associated to it. And this hard problem is much harder than factoring. And the result is, therefore, is that we can make the keys smaller, which means the cryptography fits in smaller devices. It goes faster. So you have less bandwidth, less power, less code, less memory and footprint, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it gives you much more bang for your bucks in terms of security per bit, which is really cool. But the other thing that elliptic curve cryptography gives you is that you could do lots more cool stuff with it that you can't do with the RSA scheme. So there's this thing called the Diffie-Hellman Protocol. And the Diffie-Hellman Protocol comes in all sorts of shapes and sizes and different applications. And so, for example, when we do HTTPS, if we're using the new version of TLS, then we actually use a Diffie-Hellman protocol. But interestingly, in Signal, we also use Diffie-Hellman protocols. And Signal is this kind of really cool application, and it uses Diffie-Hellman in a way which allows us to retain security even once we've lost security. So with Signal, once you lose security, you only have to send a few more messages and you get security back. And it kind of uses this ratchet technology within Signal to do that. So you could do all sorts of cool different stuff that you couldn't do with RSA. And that's why elliptic curves are cool.
So what are the limits of elliptic curve cryptography? There's post-quantum computing. Is there a relationship there?
So this is the big question. So we have this thing called we have these things called quantum computers, which no one's quite built yet. And then if someone built a quantum computer, we are then in the post-quantum world, okay? So let's look into the future. So if you built a quantum computer of a significant size, you would be able to break RSA and you would be able to break elliptic curve cryptography, which means you'd break Signal, you'd break HTTPS, you'd break everything, you'd break into the banks, everything would be insecure, and we'd be back to the Stone Ages, otherwise known as the 1960s in computers, right? So we'd be really bad. So what people are looking at now is there's a big effort to look at something called what's called post-quantum cryptography. And post-quantum cryptography is looking at cryptographic schemes which are secure even when you have a quantum computer. Now, people might have heard of quantum key distribution. This is not quantum key distribution. Quantum key distribution is some physical way of just generating keys. It's not really that applicable in the real world. But post-quantum cryptography is really heavily applicable because what we do is we use it on standard computers, but the cryptography is secure even if the adversary has access to a quantum computer. So the kind of mathematical problems that you get in post-quantum cryptography is a weird problems related to what's called lattice-based cryptography, which is kind of weird multi-dimensional stuff. Or actually something that's actually related to elliptic curves, which is quite interesting. There's a new area called isogeny-based cryptography, which acts as a much more complex version of elliptic curve cryptography, which is secure against, or is believed to be secure against quantum computers.